Hello and welcome to this third seminar presentation where we're going to introduce the third part of X-bar theory. This time we're going to be introducing an element called an adjunct, which is very different from the specifiers and the complements that we've already introduced. Let's first recap what we've said so far. So far we've looked at two of the rules of X-bar theory. One of them says that an XP contains a YP in front of an X bar. That YP is the specifier, the X bar is the lower level, the level down from the XP. XP could be represented as an X with two bars on it, so the idea is every time you come down a level, you reduce by one bar. Okay. The next rule then tells us what to do with the X bar, and that says that it's made up of a head, an X, plus a YP, which is the complement. Therefore, this rule produces a phrase that looks like this. This particular one is of an IP, so it's a clause, and that's a very good example of this kind of structure because the IP always contains these three elements. The specifier position is the YP underneath the IP, and that's the subject. The head is the inflection, and the VP is in the complement position. So we have these two positions related to the head. We've got the complement position and the specifier position. Now, not every phrase will look like this simply because the complement and the specifier position don't have to appear in every phrase. They do in sentences, but not every phrase has a complement or specifier position. The only element that is absolutely necessary in any phrase is the head. So you can have a phrase that consists of just the head, and that will have this structure. On the other hand, you can have a complement but without the specifier. So this is also a possible X-bar structure. And finally, you can have the specifier without the complement, and it would look like that. So these rules then produce these kinds of phrase structures. As I said, they all have heads, they all have X-bars, and they all have XPs. So in every single phrase, you've got these three levels of projection of the head, but they differ in terms of whether or not the complements and specifiers appear. Complements, when they do appear, always follow the head. Specifiers always precede the head in English. When we analyse phrases, we can also find evidence of the existence of another kind of element, which is called a modifier. Now, this has different properties to anything we've seen so far, and we can start to look at those differences by first of all comparing them to complements. In order to do that, consider the following two DPs, the signpost to London and the signpost which points to London. Now, at first you might be forgiven to believe that these two DPs mean pretty much the same thing, but that they don't have the same meaning can be fairly easily demonstrated. Suppose we have this object here. This is clearly a signpost, and what's more, it's the signpost to London. We know that because it's got London written on it. Okay, so this, I think, can be fairly straightforwardly identified as the signpost to London. Is it the signpost which points to London? Well, if London happens to be here and the signpost is pointing at it, then yes, indeed, this signpost is the signpost which points to London. But we could take the same object and just point it somewhere else. Okay, now we still have the signpost to London here. It's a signpost, it's got London written on it, so it obviously is the signpost to London. But this particular instance of this signpost happens not to be pointing to London, but somewhere else, say Paris. So actually this is not the signpost which points to London, even though it is the signpost to London. It's the signpost which points to Paris. So clearly then, these two phrases don't mean the same thing. They don't identify the same element in the universe. So they have different meanings. What's actually going on here? Well, if we look at it, this to London element here is clearly naming an essential part of this object. Okay, signposts, just because of the meaning of the noun signpost, are necessarily things which are to places. Okay, if you're a signpost and you're not to anywhere, then, well, you're not really a signpost at all. You're just a plaque on a piece of wood, on a pole. That's not a signpost. The signpost has to be to somewhere in order to be a signpost. So that to London there is naming an essential part of the meaning of the noun. And that's essentially what a complement is. A complement, as we've seen, is very closely associated with the head of the phrase. The head imposes selection or restrictions on its complement, and that's because the two tend to be semantically connected in as much as the complement names an essential part of the meaning of the head. So we can say that complements name essential properties of heads. Compare that to the which points to London. Now this is a modifier, and modifiers don't have the same function as complements do. What this modifier is doing here is just adding extra information about the particular signpost that we're talking about. Okay, this one happens to point to London. That isn't a necessary, essential property of a signpost. That it happens to point to certain places is a fact about that signpost in a particular world. Okay, the world could be such that this signpost happens to point to London, or the world could be such that it doesn't point to London. So therefore, where it's pointing to is an accidental property of that signpost, not something which is an essential property. So modifiers, then, we can say, name accidental properties of heads, the properties that they have by dint of being in the particular universe that they exist in, not some properties that they have independent of the universe. Okay, so clearly then modifiers and complements fulfill different functions when it comes to how we interpret them within a phrase. Now, not only that, but we can also see other differences in the use of complements and modifiers, and this can be best done by looking at modifiers that appear with verbs. We know that verbs select for different complements. We've got here the verb to yawn, as in John yawned, which is an intransitive verb, meaning that it doesn't select for any complement at all. Inspect, on the other hand, is a verb which is a transitive verb, and therefore it takes a DP complement. Different verbs take different complements as part of their selectional properties. And if you try to give an intransitive verb an object, and you try to take the object away from the transitive verb, you're going to get something that is ungrammatical, because here these two sentences defy the selectional properties of the individual verbs involved. Okay, you can't say John yawned the file or John inspected. Okay, so that is due to the relationship between the head and the complement. Now, you can, however, give something else alongside an intransitive verb. So intransitive verbs aren't just verbs that only appear all by themselves. There can be other elements that appear. One such thing is an adverbial phrase like secretly. Now this is a modifier. If you think about it, it's adding extra information about this particular yawning. Yawning doesn't have to be done overtly or secretly or in any particular way. A yawn is a yawn. The only thing that it needs is somebody who does it. Okay, there must be a yawner involved, but apart from that, nothing else is necessary about with yawn. So anything that we add to give extra information is obviously going to be a modifier. So this secretly is a modifier that can appear alongside the intransitive verb yawn. It doesn't have to be an adverb phrase either. It could be a preposition phrase. And again, this is doing the same thing, adding extra information this time about when the yawning took place. And again, that's extra information. It's not specifically essential information about yawning. If you give a definition of what yawning is, nobody ever mentions when it takes place. Okay, so clearly it's not part of the meaning of yawn that it has to take place at a particular time. This preposition phrase just gives us that extra piece of information. It's a modifier. Now the interesting thing is we can add exactly the same modifiers to all verbs. Okay, so John inspected the file secretly, or John inspected the file at noon. Moreover, not only can you add one modifier to each of these verbs, but you can add as many as you like. You can keep on adding modifiers. Okay, so John yawned at noon secretly, and John inspected the file at noon secretly. Okay, and you could keep on going on, adding more and more modifiers. That's a property that we'll look at in a second. But the point I'm trying to make at the moment is that clearly there is no restriction placed on modifiers. Unlike complements, as we've seen, complements are restricted by the head's selectional properties. If the head selects for the complement must appear. If the head doesn't select for the complement can't appear. But modifiers can appear with any head, so there's clearly no restrictive relationship between a head and a modifier, and therefore you can have any modifier with any head and any number of modifiers with any head. Now, as we said, that then complements being selected by the head, there can only be the specified number of them. If the head selects for no complements, then there will be no complements, 0 complements. If the head selects for one complement, there'll be one complement. But modifiers are not selected, therefore there can be any number of them, from 0 to, well, in principle, infinity. Okay, so you can have any number of modifiers as they are not selected by heads. Now, this requires us to introduce another notion and go into how this notion is captured using grammatical rules. The notion that we need here is something called recursion. Now, a recursive structure is one in which a structure contains an element which is the same as itself. A good example that we've already come across is the fact that sentences, or IPs, can contain IPs in their subject positions. So you can have a sentence which is the subject of another sentence, and they look like this. Now, this is a recursive construction because we have an IP inside an IP. And what that means is that if that IP can be inside an IP, then it can also have an IP inside that. And then that can also have an IP inside it, and so forth and so on. And you can see that we can keep on going, getting bigger and bigger sentences, all of which have IPs as their subjects. So, for example, we could take a sentence like John is an idiot, and we could make that the subject of another sentence, like that John is an idiot is obvious. And then you could take that and make that the subject of another sentence, that John is an idiot is obvious, upsets his mother. Now, admittedly, we can't go much further than that, but it's not because of anything to do with the grammar. The grammar says you can have IPs in specifier position of IPs, in subject position. Okay. If we try to extend that any further, we're going to end up with a sentence which gets very difficult to try to comprehend. But that's a problem with our processing abilities, our ability to deal with long and complicated sentences. After a while, we get confused, and the processors that we have to try and do that just fall apart, and we end up not being able to see where the sentence, how the sentence is organized. But as I say, that's nothing to do with the grammar, that's entirely to do with the limitations of our own processing abilities in our head, not anything to do with our knowledge of grammar. Our knowledge of grammar tells us that IPs can be in the specifier of IPs, and that's a recursive kind of thing. Basically what recursion is all about then is rules where we have the input appearing in the output of the rule. So here we've got a rule that says an IP contains an IP. So the input is an IP and one of its outputs is an IP. Okay, which therefore means that we can then go back to the beginning and reapply the rule again. So that IP could contain an IP, and then back to the beginning, that IP could contain an IP, and so forth and so on. This is a case of immediate recursion, where one thing directly contains an instance of itself. However, there are other instances of recursion which are visible over a set of rules rather than over a single rule. For example, consider this structure. Here we've got a verb phrase headed by a verb which takes an IP as its complement. Okay, we do get such verbs. Verbs can have IP complements, and things like say, John left, Mary said, John left. But VPs are also parts of IPs. VPs are the complements of inflections, and inflections are the heads of IPs. So you can get a VP inside an IP, but you can again get an IP inside a VP. And then we're going to get a recursive relationship there, because once we're back to the IP, we get another VP, and then you could have another IP inside that VP, and so forth and so on. For example, take a sentence, John remembers. You can give remember a clause as its complement, and you could say John remembers that Bill knows. Knows can also be a verb with a clausal complement, so you can say John remembers that Bill knows that Mary believes. Okay, believe could also have a clause, and you would say John remembers that Bill knows that Mary believes that Fred said something or other. Anyway, note, you can these types of sentences are easier to process. You can keep on adding and adding to them for quite a long while before your processor starts to fail and you get confused by them. This again shows us that this is nothing to do with the grammar, it's just to do with how good you are at processing sentences. Humans tend to be better at processing these type of sentences, where sentences get added successively to the end of the sentence, but when sentences are added successively to the beginnings of the sentence, that's more difficult for us to cope with. Again, nothing to do with the grammar. This is entirely a limitation of the way our brain works. What we've got here then is recursion, as I said, over a set of rules. Here we've got an IP can contain a VP. Ultimately, obviously, that's a shorthand notion, a shorthand notation for a number of rules that we've already looked at. And then the VP can contain an IP. Okay, and then once you've got that IP, you can come back to the beginning and say your IP contains a VP, etc., etc. So we can see how this recursion works over the set of rules rather than within a single rule. It's still recursion, however, because it can keep on going, and that's how come we can keep on adding these extra structures. Now, I think it's fairly clear that modifiers are therefore recursive, because you can add as many modifiers as you like. Let's have a look at how it would look like. So here we've got a sentence, John will leave. We've got a verb phrase with just an intransitive verb in it. Okay, it doesn't have a complement, doesn't have a specifier, but we can add a modifier to it. And presumably when you add the modifier to it, you get a larger phrase. So we end up with something that looks like this. Here, in a hurry is a prepositional phrase modifier, modifying the verb phrase to leave. Okay, and then we get a phrase. Then we can add another modifier, on Wednesday, this time a time modifier telling us when the leaving took place rather than the manner it took place in. Okay, that's going to give us another prepositional phrase attached to our phrase. Okay, now the immediate question that arises at this point is, what is XP? What kind of a phrase is this phrase? Well, if you look at the way these phrases distribute, you'll notice all of them have exactly the same distribution. They all follow the inflection. Now, inflections, we know, take VP complements. In fact, they don't take anything else other than a VP complement. So that the fact that it can take leave as its complement, as it did in the first place, John will leave, means that that's a VP. But then it can take leave in a hurry as its complement. And therefore we come to the conclusion that that must be a VP. And it can take leave in a hurry on Wednesday as a complement. And that therefore must be a VP. So all of these phrases have the same distribution, therefore they are of the same category. They're all VPs. And then we can plainly see here the recursive nature of the adjunct, because what the adjunct is something added to a VP next to another VP. So that VP contains a VP, and then the next VP contains another VP, and then you get down to the single verb leave. Okay, so clearly then modifiers are recursive. Now that means that we're going to need another rule. Here are the two rules that we've already introduced. The first rule is the specifier rule, introducing the specifier in the X bar. The second rule is the complement rule, telling us how to expand the X bar into the head and the complement. Now we need another rule then to add the adjunct. This is the structure that we get with the complement and the specifier added. Okay, those two positions are defined here. We therefore need another rule that tells us that you can add a phrase to the top of another phrase and get exactly the same kind of phrase. So what we want is something like that. Now, the position that we introduce here is called the adjunct position. Now, modifiers are adjuncts. What's the difference between those two terms? Well, modifier relates to the function that the phrase has in another phrase. It's a bit like subject or object, referring to the function that these elements play. Note, different elements can be subjects, different categories can be subjects, and also not every specifier is a subject. Okay, we've seen that we've got specifiers which are possessors, not subjects. So the position is referred to as the specifier position. The subject of certain phrases, i.e. IPs, is the subject. Similarly with complement, not every complement is an object. An object is a particular type of complement, a complement of a verb, which is a transitive verb. And again, so we see that then object, the term object, names a function of a phrase within another phrase. Well, modifier has the same status, but complement and specifier name the positions within the X bar structure, and the position of the modifier is that of an adjunct. Okay, so we call this an adjunct, and the kind of structure that we get when we add an adjunct is called an adjunction. Okay, so where you have an XP inside an XP, that is going to be an adjunction structure adding the adjunct. And as you can see, that rule is exactly a recursive rule. It's an immediately recursive rule because its input contains the output. The XP contains an XP as well as the adjunct. Okay, therefore this rule immediately explains why you can have any number of adjuncts, because the rule that introduces it is a recursive rule. The same is not true of the specifier and the complement rule. The specifier rule says an XP contains a YP and an X bar, not an XP. So that's not a recursive. The XP is not contained in the output of the rule. Similarly, the complement rule has an X bar containing an X, not an X bar. So that's not a recursive rule either. Therefore, there's only ever going to be one possible complement, one possible specifier, because once the rule is applied, that's it. It can't apply anymore. But a recursive rule can keep on applying, and therefore you're going to get able to get any number of adjuncts. Now, what we've got here then is a set of positions inside a phrase. The complement position, the specifier position, the adjunct position. All of these positions differ from one another uniquely, so much that you can identify what element you're looking at just by looking at its position. Now, to see that more clearly, we need to introduce a bit more terminology. You can view syntactic trees not only like biological trees but also like family trees. A family tree gives a sort of like a list of ancestors where certain ancestors give birth to next generation, and then that generation gives birth to. So you could look at a syntactic tree like that. Now, once you've seen that, we can start naming the relationships that hold between elements. So a node on a tree that gives birth to other nodes, i.e. that there's direct branches coming out from that node, that's called the mother. Okay, so of this whole structure here, the XP at the top is the mother of the next XP and the YP below it. Obviously, something which is given birth to by a mother is the daughter. So a mother has daughters and daughters have mothers. Now, any two elements which have the same mother are going to be called sisters. Okay, so at the very bottom we have X bar as the mother of X and YP. They're both the daughters of X bar, and because they're both the daughters of the same mother, they are sisters. X is the sister to the complement YP. Okay, don't ask me what happened to all the men in syntactic structures. It's a sad thing and linguists don't like to talk about it. Anyway, there are mothers, daughters, and sisters. Now, on those relationships, then we can identify the specific positions of complements, specifiers, and adjuncts. Note, the complement has its sister as an X, the head, so the complement is the sister of the head. Its mother is the X bar. Specifier, however, is very different from that. Its sister is the X bar, and its mother is the XP. The adjunct is again different from that because although its mother is an XP, its sister is an XP. That's why it's recursive. Its mother and its sister are the same thing. So given that you've got a sister which is the same thing as the mother, then that can also have the same structure, and that will be a recursive thing. Okay, so this is how we can define these positions as unique to these elements, and these elements all have different properties. Okay, let's look at some specific adjuncts. Let's look at adjuncts to verbs and verb phrases. Okay, with a verb phrase like left, an intransitive verb, we can add an adverb modifier quickly to it, and we can get John left quickly. So what we have here is an AP adjoined to the verb phrase, so its mother is a VP, its sister is a VP, and then that VP just contains the verb left. But note, you can also put the adverbial modifier in front of the verb. You can say John quickly left. Now what that indicates is that adjuncts, unlike specifiers and complements, can actually come either side of the element to which it's adjoined. Okay, so you can adjoin this AP to the left or to the right of the VP which it adjoins to. That's very different from specifiers, which always come in front of the phrases that they specify, and it's very different from complements because complements always come behind the heads that they are complements to. So here we see another different property of adjuncts to specifiers and complements. Apparently it's adjuncts can come either side of the phrase. Now that means we're going to need to modify slightly our adjunct rule. Here's the adjunct rule, and we've modified it simply by putting that comma between the XP and the YP. We say this XP can be made up of an XP and a YP. The comma indicates that no order is actually specified here. that the XP and the YP inside the XP can come in either order. Okay, so that's all we need to do to modify this rule, and now we can say complements can come either side. Now, that modifiers can come either side of the head, and modifiers are recursive, so you can have any number of them, means that you could, in principle, have one to the left and one to the right. For example, like this one, John quickly left in his car. Quickly is a modifier, in his car is a modifier. They're both modifying the verb phrase, and one is to the left and one is to the right. Therefore, we have this kind of phrase here. Okay, quickly is adjoined to the VP left, and in his car is adjoined to the VP quickly left. Now note, that would seem to indicate that we've put this together by first adjoining quickly to the VP and then adjoining in his car to the VP that results from that adjunction. But in principle, we could have done it the other way round. We could have adjoined the preposition phrase first to the right, and then the adverb phrase second to the left. Well, yes, that's true. The rule will allow us to do either of these things, so both of these structures are perfectly grammatical. There's nothing to prevent us from producing either. It might be that they have a slight difference in meaning. For example, this one here means that in his car is modifying the VP left, so the leaving took place in his car, and then the AP quickly modifies that VP, i.e. leaving in his car. So what we're saying here is that the leaving in the car happened quickly, whereas the other one, quickly is modifying leaving, so we've got quickly left being modified by in his car. So the quick leaving took place in his car. Now, if you can detect any difference in meaning between those two things, then I think you're a better person than most, because I certainly find it difficult to see that there's any difference in meaning at all. So therefore, what we can do is we can allow both of these structures to take place, and we don't need to impose any restrictions saying one of them as opposed to the other one must happen, because that would just be adding extra complications to the grammar which have absolutely no effect whatsoever. So they would be superfluous things, and we don't want to have superfluous complications added to the grammar. We might as well allow both of these things to happen and it not cause any problems. One last thing to say about adjunction is that it's not just phrases where we can get adjuncts. Okay, so far every instance of an adjunct that we've looked at has been a phrase adjoined to a phrase, but you can also get adjunction within the word. For example, take this word here, blackboard. Okay, we know that this is a noun, and in fact it's a special kind of a noun called a compound noun. Compound nouns are nouns made up of two other words. In particular, what we've got here is an adjective, black, and a noun, board. Both of these two go together to form a noun, a compound noun. Okay, so this is the structure of a compound noun. Now, if you look carefully at it, you'll notice that the adjective here is adjoined to the noun. Its mother is a noun, its sister is a noun. Okay, and if you remember, that's exactly the definition of an adjunct. An adjunct has its mother and its sister as the same thing. Take a look at this adjunct here. The YP is adjoined to the XP. Its mother is an XP, its sister is an XP. What we've got with our compound noun is that the Y part, the black bit, is adjoined to a noun. Its mother is a noun, its sister is a noun. Okay, so actually we have got head adjuncts here, things which adjoin themselves to heads rather than to phrases. The compound noun isn't the only example of such a thing. Last week we came across these phrasal verbs. A phrasal verb is a verb that's made up of a verb and some other element, a preposition. Okay, Note here we've got the preposition adjoined to the verb. Its mother is the verb, its sister is the verb. Okay, and this time this adjunct follows the verb, whereas with the compound noun the adjective preceded. So again, we've got the same sort of property that adjunct can either precede or follow whatever it is that they're adjoined to. Now, because you can get adjuncts to heads as well as to phrases, again we need to slightly modify our rule to accommodate these possibilities. The rule that we're going to propose looks a little bit more complicated, but actually it isn't. What this rule says is an x with n number of bars is made up of an x with n number of bars and a y with n number of bars. Now the n number of bars is going to be the same throughout this rule. Okay, so if x is 2, i.e. if n is 2, i.e. we've got n with 2 bars on it, okay, that's a phrase, an xp. And then we're going to get an xp is made up of an xp and a yp. Okay, that's a phrase adjunct. On the other hand, if n is 0, then x0 is a head. So that we're going to say that an x0 is made up of an x0 and a y0. And that's going to be a head adjunct. Okay, so by just generalizing this rule slightly more than we had before, we can now accommodate the fact that you can get both phrasal adjunction, the adjunction of a phrase to a phrase, or head adjunction, the adjunction of a word to a head. Okay, let's just summarize everything that we've just said so far then. Okay, X-bar theory allows 4 elements. It defines the position for 4 elements, and this is it. There's no more to be added to this, so those 3 rules are all we need to capture every single phrase and phrase structure that there exists in hopefully all languages. Okay, we have the head position, which is the central position, the element that projects its categorical nature up through the structure via the I bar to the via the X bar to the XP. Okay, next to the head, the sister of the head, we've got the complement position. Okay, that's sister of the head and obviously daughter of the X bar, which is the thing that comes immediately above it. Then we have the specifier higher up in the structure, the daughter of the XP, the next level up. That's sister to the X bar. And then we have the adjunction. Okay, the adjunct is sister of the XP, daughter to the XP. Complements always follow the head, specifiers always precede, and adjuncts can come either side of the head. It very much depends on the adjunct itself. Adverb phrases can either come one side or the other. Preposition phrases tend to follow. Adjectival phrase modifiers inside an NP, for example, tend to precede. So different adjuncts tend to pick one side or the other, but generally adjuncts can come either side. Modifiers are all adjuncts. They have certain properties, they're optional, okay, and that's because you don't have to apply the adjunction rule. The adjunction rule says an XP contains an XP, or you could have started with the XP contains a specifier and an X bar. So you didn't have to apply the adjunction rule at all. You can always start without that. So you don't have to have an adjunct. But the rule itself is a recursive rule, so therefore once you've got an adjunct, you can keep on adding them. Okay, so you can have any number of adjuncts from 0 to infinity. They're not selected, which means that they can go along with any phrase. You can add an adjunct to anything, and that will be fine. There's no restrictive relationship between particular heads and particular adjuncts. They come either side of the head, as I've said, depending on the adjunct itself. Certain adjuncts choose or prefer certain positions either in front or behind, and they can be adjoined either to phrases or to zero bar level elements, i.e. heads, and therefore you can get a phrasal adjunct, which is a phrase itself, or you can get a head adjunct, which is a word. Okay, that's all we need to know then about X-bar theory and the kinds of phrases that it allows. Next week we'll go on to start to see how this applies further and some other syntactic phenomena that we need to know about. Okay, bye bye.